Hey guys, it's Jaden, and I built my first custom keyboard. I'm going to be going over all the parts I use for this build, the building process, and sharing with you guys my personal experience after building my first custom keyboard. Building a custom keyboard has been something that I've always wanted to do, but never got around to actually doing it. After spending hours and hours of talking to other people that had built keyboards before and checking to see if the parts that I wanted to get were compatible, I finally came up with a build. So here are the parts that I used for my custom keyboard. As for the case, I went with the tofu acrylic. This was a case that I had seen many other creators use in their first build, and it was something that really caught my eye. I picked up the tofu acrylic because of the diffused look, and that leads me to the PCB. As for the PCB, I went with the Instant 60. Now, I was debating between the DZ60, the 1-Up PCB, but I decided to go with the Instant 60. It had RGB underglow, which was exactly what I needed. For the plate, I went with a brass plate, and I was debating between polycarbonate and brass. I'd watched a ton of sound tests with the switches I chose in brass plates and polycarbonate cases, and I decided to go with the brass plate because I liked the sound of it. And for the switches, I went with ink blacks. Now, I was debating between going with a more budget-friendly switch option, but the ink blacks were just my dream switch. So many different sound test videos of different switches, and ink blacks just became my favorite. And I got lucky when I was going to buy all my parts that they were in stock on KBD Fans. Now, ink blacks are a little bit more on the pricey end for switches. Nothing like Telios V2s, but they do cost around $7.50 for 10 switches. For the stabilizers, I went with Durock V2s. First off, these were screw-in stabilizers, and second off, I did not have to clip these stabilizers. I'd heard many great things about these stabilizers, so I decided to pick them up. As for the keycaps, I went with some Japanese keycaps from Banggood. I picked white keycaps so that it would match any type of RGB that I wanted with my case. And I'll have links to every single thing that I used in this video down below in the video description below if you guys are interested in checking them out. Now let's get into the scariest part for me, and that's building the actual keyboard. I was nervous that I was going to overlube some switches or completely screw up my stabilizers. But after watching a few videos, it really helped with the overall building process. I first decided to lube all of the switches. Now I bought a few extras just in case I needed it. I watched a few videos on how to lube switches and how to do it efficiently and quickly because I knew this would be a tedious and long process. I first started by getting 3 different bowls. Then I opened up every single switch and divided every component into each bowl, starting with the stem in one bowl, the spring in another bowl, and the top and bottom housing in the third bowl. I didn't have a 4th bowl, otherwise I would have split up the top and bottom housings, but it just was fine for me. I made sure to do this first so that I didn't open a switch, lube it, put it back together, open a switch, lube it, you get the point. Then I started the lubing process. I made sure that I got an even coat of lube on my brush, and as for the lube, I went with Krytox 205 grade 0. I lubed the bottom housing first, make sure to get an even coat on either side of the switch. As for the springs, I sped up the process tremendously by using a method called bag lubing. I simply took a Ziploc bag, took my brush, and applied a generous amount of Krytox 205 grade 0 into the bag, put all my springs into it, and shook it without squeezing the bag, and it allowed for an even coat of lube on all of the springs. Then I went on to lube the stem. I've used this tool, I can't remember what it's called, but this was so helpful. It allowed me to grab the stem in one hand and lube with my other hand. After this process was done, I simply just placed it back in place, put the top housing on, and I snapped it all into place. And I repeated this 80 times. This process took forever, and I would highly recommend watching a Netflix show, watching a YouTube video. I watched Twitch the whole time because this process took me about 3.5 hours. Now, I was very careful when it came to lubing switches because I didn't want to accidentally overlube anything. I didn't want to have to go back, take apart certain switches, clean the lube off, re-lube it, so I wanted to make sure I did it right the first time. Then after switches were done, I tested the PCB. I plugged it in to make sure the RGB was working, and I tested every key with a key tester. Once that was done and everything was working properly, I then moved on to the stabilizers. This was something that took a lot of learning, and after watching a few videos from Teha Types, it really made the process simpler. When it came to the stabilizers, I was debating between using Krytox or dielectric grease. I decided to go with Krytox because after watching a ton of videos, a lot of people recommend this, as some people said that dielectric grease allowed for a more mushy feel with the stabilizers. I would love to do more builds in the future, and if I do, I would love to give dielectric grease a try when it comes to stabilizers. But for my personal build, I decided to go with Krytox. Now, after I installed all the stabilizers onto the PCB, I popped in some switches, put on a few keycaps, and I tested the stabilizers. Now, the first time around, I underlubed my spacebar, so I went back, took everything apart, added a little bit more lube, and it sounded a lot better. I didn't do any fancy mods to the stabilizers, and if I do build more keyboards in the future, I would love to test out a few different mods like band-aiding and other things like that, but for this specific build, I didn't do any of that. Now, the stabilizers, in my opinion, aren't bad, but I do feel like some of the keys, such as my enter key and shift key, could use a little bit of work. After that was done, the plate was installed, all the switches were installed, I screwed it into the case. This was also a very aggravating part because I would try to screw the PCB into the case and I would accidentally lose control of the screw and would fall all the way through the PCB. I would have to shake it out or start all over. And centering the PCB in the case to make sure all the screws lined up properly was really difficult. The first time around, after I'd screwed everything in, I put on the keycaps in the bottom right and they were rubbing against the case. Turns out I didn't line all the screws up properly, so I had to unscrew it all and then redo it. It was a good learning experience, and now I know that it's so important to make sure all the screws are lined up perfectly. After that was done, I installed all the keycaps and we were good to go. I felt so relieved. This process took hours, from watching YouTube videos to make sure I was doing everything properly, to just figuring out and learning by doing it. I made so many mistakes with this keyboard, from overlooping certain switches to doing my stabilizers. But after everything was finished, I was so relieved. And with that being said, here's a sound test. Now, I think overall, I did a decent job when it came to lubing the switches. I do feel like the stabilizers could use a good bit of work. But overall, for my first keyboard build, I was pretty happy with the way things turned out. And with the software for the PCB, it was super easy to customize between different lighting effects. Now, I'm going to be sharing with you guys my personal experience after building my first custom keyboard. First off, I never thought that lubing would actually take so long. I thought it would take an hour, but after lubing my first switch, I was like, wow, this is gonna take a lot longer than I thought, and I wanted to be very careful with it. I was so nervous to do some of the things because I was afraid I was gonna break something or anything like that, but you just gotta do it. Watch a lot of YouTube videos, learn from the pros, and you'll be able to do it yourself. There's so many great YouTubers that I learned from and really helped the process of building my first keyboard. Overall, this took a lot of patience, taking breaks, but it was a very fun experience, and I hope to do it in the future. Building keyboards is something I really want to get into. I want to build different keyboards with different plates, PCBs, cases, switches, keycaps, you name it. I want to also get into modding different stabilizers, learning how to lube switches evenly, learning how to do my stabilizers better, and everything like that. So I cannot wait to see what the future has to hold, and I'm really excited to build more keyboards in the future. With that being said, this was such a fun process, and if you want to build a keyboard yourself, I would highly recommend it. If you guys did go on to enjoy this video, don't forget to leave a like on the video and subscribe down below for more content like this. If you felt like there was any major things I could fix on my keyboard, leave them down below in the comments. I'd love to hear from you guys that maybe have a little more experience with building keyboards than I do. Thank you again for watching this video, and I will see you guys in the next one.